A lot of people are really starting to say now, though, that these polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids, especially the soybean oil, is worse than the sugar itself. And I'm starting to believe that myself.
Welcome to Price Plow.
What's going on, Price Plow Nation, and everyone out there looking for some new diet research, especially about soybean oil? This is Mike Roberto, founder of Price Plow. Now, normally on this channel, we're a tech and media company that covers the dietary supplement industry's news and reviews. But today I have some hot new research that's hot off the press because it's February 20th of 2019 and just published yesterday was a new paper that, well, it may be leading to a little bit of a scandal, but in the end, it really actually reinforces what most of us in the diet community have been preaching for well over a decade. Now, most people in the diet community who are at least well-researched, whether it's doctors, clinicians, or dietitians, or just bloggers and YouTubers like myself, anyone who's well-researched has been preaching the dangers of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, such as those that come from processed industrialized seed oils, such as canola oil / rapeseed oil or corn oil or soybean oil, safflower oil, the list goes on. And the reason being is because these have been shown to be very pro-inflammatory and conducive to diabetes, obesity, and all the diseases that come along for the ride with those. And now a 6-month controlled diet study coming out of China has demonstrated that even further, as it has shown that soybean oil is extremely damaging to the gut microbiome. But the real story here is how the researchers and the media are twisting the results of this study to try to fit their agenda, when in fact it actually reinforces 2 points that we've been stating on this channel and in the diet community in general. The first of which is that soybean oil, along with its other peers, especially soybean oil, is absolutely pro-inflammatory and toxic on multiple levels. And the second is that a low-carb, high-fat diet and a high-fat, low-carb diet can both be metabolically healthy, so long as good food selections are used. But there is a lot of danger somewhere in that middle area. And that's where we talk about this being a U-shaped curve, where one or the other is good, but in the middle, especially if you forget to prioritize protein. If you prioritize protein, both of them are good on these sides. On the inside is where the danger lies. And this study kind of shows that as well. So the study was performed in China, but it was actually run out of the University of Otago in New Zealand. And the main figure who's actually been going onto the radio shows and talking about it is a researcher known as Jim Mann, and he is a co-author on this study. And what they were trying to figure out was basically what happens when you have a low-fat, high-carb culture, such as China, who eats a lot of rice. What happens when you start adding more fat to their diet? Because as they get westernized, they start adding more fat and more of these cooking oils, unfortunately the ones that oxidize easily and don't really heat that well. So what happens when you start adding those in? So to model this, the researchers took 217 young, metabolically healthy, non-obese Chinese individuals and split them into 3 randomized groups. They all received the same amount of calories, and they all received the same amount of fiber. So the fiber thing is out of the whole equation for the gut microbiome, and they all received the same amount of protein from energy as well. But they tinkered with the fats and the carbs. So in the low-fat diet group, the participants received 20% of their calories from fat and 66% of their calories from carbohydrates. In the moderate fat diet, the subjects had 30% of their calories from fat and 56% of their calories from carbohydrates. And in the higher fat diets, the subjects had 40% of their calories from fat and then 46% of their calories from carbohydrates. Now, the reason I'm doing my air quotes right here, and also we have a blog post where I talk about all this, and I have a lot of citations to come, and that's all in the blog post. The reason I'm air quoting this and quoting this in the blog post is because higher fat, yes, it was indeed a higher fat diet. 40% is of course higher than 30 or 20%, but it is not a high fat diet. And that's what really needs to be clarified here because of the way the media is going to slant this. In fact, 46% carbohydrate, 40% fat is really in that disastrous middle where things get a little bit crazy metabolically, and we kind of see that. However, though, because calories are controlled, food was provided and protein was held constant at 14%, they actually all did lose weight. So we'll talk about some of the results there. But I would argue, and we'll talk about this in a separate video, I would say 14% of protein is like 1% too little, and that 1% actually makes a big difference given the protein leverage hypothesis, which is subject for another video. So subscribe to the channel. We'll get into that later. I've been big on that. But anyway, we have a very well-controlled diet. Food was provided, and when you have food provided to you, they did have to log, when they had food that was kind of off the reservation. When you have food provided for you, you're going to get, of course, better results than a study where it's not provided. But they were free-living individuals, and they were able to roam the streets and do as they wished in general. So this is really all about measuring the inflammation markers and the gut microbiome. Now, regarding the data that they collected, they basically they collected both blood and fecal matter, but that was only done both before the intervention started and after. So, and honestly, that's pretty reasonable. Even if you're given free food and paid, I don't think you want to be giving a stool sample every week or even every month or anything like that. So we'll take what we get here, and the data does seem to be pretty solid here. And it definitely makes sense given everything that we know about soybean oil as well. And we'll get to that. So they basically covered all the general metabolic lipid markers, as well as collecting some of the inflammatory biomarkers that are typically used. And on top of that, looking at certain bacterium in the stool samples. Okay, so far everything actually makes sense. This looks like a pretty cool, well-constructed study, given that we understand that the higher fat diet is not necessarily a high fat diet. It is like one of these balanced diets that puts you in the danger zone of forgetting to eat your protein because you're eating ice cream all day long. But anyway, when your food's provided for you, it works out pretty well. The problem here, and this is where we get into a lot of problems, is that they used soybean oil to increase the amount of fat for those two groups that had higher fat diets. Now, I'm going to quote what the researchers said here, and they said, "We achieved the required macronutrient distribution in the three diet groups by replacing a proportion of energy derived from carbohydrate, mainly white rice and wheat flour, the most consumed carbohydrate sources in Asia, with fats, mainly soybean oil, the most widely used edible oil in Asia." Now, in Asia, they eat a lot of meat. Hong Kong, for instance, is the highest per capita meat consumer, but they didn't use animal fats here. They used soybean oil. Now, at this point, we need to start talking about the dangers of soybean oil, because as a future quote we're going to talk about here in this article, they actually used up to 24% of calories from soybean oil. And that is a massive amount, totally massive amount. So soybean oil is, as I've mentioned, an industrialized processed seed oil, and it's obtained from the seeds of the soybean, which are milled down, and then they're solvent extracted with hexanes in order to get the oil out. So that's basically what you're eating there. And what you're left with is this omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid that is very unstable. It's erroneously referred to as vegetable oil, but honestly, that's not true because it's not a vegetable. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of different studies here. So all these studies are cited. A lot of them are full text open access. A lot of these studies are cited in the blog post, so refer back to them. So let's just go down the list and talk about what soybean oil does. I'm not going to get into the pure mechanisms. We can get into that later on how it works. But basically, here's what we've seen from soybean oil. So we've long known that soybean oil is pro-inflammatory and obesogenic. For instance, a 2011 study showed that soybean oil disrupted and negatively affected literally every single metabolic biomarker after just one day, 24 hours of use. It ruins your blood work. 1 day's use of it. Further, in 2012, research showed that in general, all these omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids could potentiate inflammatory processes and consequently predispose to or exacerbate many inflammatory diseases. And they go on, including chronic inflammatory diseases such as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and Alzheimer's disease. In general, the increased omega-6 fatty acid intake correlates with a higher risk of autoimmune disorder, and much of this is speculated because of its ease of oxidation, especially when heated, and it's used as a cooking oil. And this causes deleterious health effects. That's what the study says, including increased cardiovascular disease risk factors. Meanwhile, the rats fare no better. I know we're not rats and we like to stick with human studies, but it's good to see because sometimes these studies become so unethical that I wouldn't even want them done on a rat, to be honest with you, but we learn some things from rats. Anyway, the rat studies showed that soybean oil is more obesogenic and causes more diabetes than fructose and coconut oil. And fructose is obviously one thing that is always attacked by the community. It turns out that soybean oil is even worse. And the thing is, this is nothing new. These mechanisms have been covered for over 15 years, and the actions behind those mechanisms have been covered since the early 90s. There's absolutely nothing new here. And that's what's scary, is the fact that these researchers actually knew the risks that they're putting at least 2/3 of the participants under. They knew. They even say it in the study. It's buried on page 10 or so of the 12-page study, but they say it right off the bat. They commit the cardinal sin. First, do no harm. And they did exactly that by knowingly putting these subjects under a metabolic and gastrointestinal distress for the sake of pushing an anti-high-fat agenda when this wasn't even a high-fat study. So they discuss it on page 10 of the study, and they say, it should be noted that the intake of polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, was relatively high in the higher fat diet group, 24% of total energy, owing to exclusive use of soybean oil, which is rich in N=6 PUFA. A higher intake of N6 PUFA has been reported to have pro-inflammatory effects. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they subjected about 150 individuals to this diet. At least 1/3 of the 217 they subjected to 24% of this toxic sludge. So this leads me to wonder, how can you consciously, ethically do that? We're already coming in with a biased study. And now we see that they already understood the underlying research and they threw that soybean oil in there. They didn't throw it in, they dredged it in there. 24% of soybean oil. They knew exactly what they were doing, and I claim that this was unethical. I wouldn't want to see this done on rats, let alone on humans. Now, I don't know how it all works in China or everything, but to me, this is a disaster waiting to happen. So unfortunately for those subjects, but I guess for the greater good of everyone else who hopefully can learn something from this, such as, well, we're going to see the data, but don't want to eat a lot of soybean oil, we get to learn a little bit of information from Jim Mann and his team of researchers, and that reinforces the fact that soybean oil is toxic. Now, onto the results of the study. First, we got to give you some of the good news. And the good news is that all the groups lost weight. This is, again, this is expected when all your food's provided for you, and they kept protein at 14%, which sadly, I think that's a touch low, like I said, but it's also probably greater than a lot of China's already getting. And being the macronutrient that provides the most satiety, and the food was already provided, you're going to have some good effects. So all of the groups did indeed lose weight, but that lower fat group indeed lost the most amount of weight. And I've already hypothesized the whole, dangerous middle that we're in, especially given the obesogenic nature of the soybean oil that they gave everyone. It's not surprising. The low-fat group that didn't get as much soybean oil lost more weight. In addition, all the groups had improved cholesterol numbers, and they all had lower waist ratios. So out of all these numbers, a lot of times, the most important thing is just the waistline and the waist to hip ratio and all that stuff. And so the waistlines did go down in all the groups. So, this is short term, the calorie equation still makes sense. It works for weight loss, and waist circumference did go down. But now for the bad news with the soybean oil groups. So unfortunately, these higher fat diet groups, let's just call them the soybean, let's call it what it is. It's the soybean oil group. They actually had lower amounts when analyzing their fecal matter from post to pre. They had worsened amounts of the healthy bacteria, such as Flauscia and fecal bacterium. Flauscia is a beneficial proacetate, probutyrate bacteria, and the butyric acid is very healthy for the colon And a lot of people believe that that is what's responsible for like a carnivore dieter who gets zero fiber in, still being able to pass stool just perfectly fine, if not better, than someone who has a very high fiber diet, such as a vegan. Meanwhile, fecal bacterium is very well known to be anti-inflammatory as well. So unfortunately, the more soybean oil that was given, the worse the levels of these two healthy bacteria were. Simultaneously, the high soybean oil groups had higher amounts of the harmful bacteria, such as allosteps and bacteroids. So, we don't really know, and we're going to get into this, we don't really know all about the gut microbiome. This is all new stuff, but these two have been correlated, or the latter of these two at least, has been correlated with diminished lipid biomarkers. So we see that when we have this lower, we also have poor blood work. And that kind of happened a little bit here where the blood work wasn't as good. Even though there was weight loss and blood markers did improve, it wasn't as improved as those who didn't receive the soybean oil. So there's correlational factors here. Not good enough, but that's kind of like where we are with the gut microbiome as it is. What's more important that we do know about, of course, is insulin and diabetes and blood sugar and all that. But that's not really what we're talking about in this study at least. Furthermore, and possibly more disastrously, the inflammation biomarkers were far worse in the soybean oil group. These individuals had higher amounts of all type of inflammatory acids, such as arachidonic acid, palmitic acid, and stearic acid. So all in all, while some health markers definitely improved, thanks to the caloric restriction, basically every single biomarker available was worse in the high soybean oil group as compared to the group receiving less soybean oil. Everything. It may have improved, certain things may have improved, but it was still worse. Okay, so at this point, what's the problem? It seems like a pretty good study. It was only measured pre and post, but it does teach us some good stuff, such as stay away from soybean oil. What's the big problem here? The problem is the way that the media and the researchers themselves are actually pushing the results, and they're using it to attack high-fat diets. But anyone who's followed a true low carbohydrate diet, and I define a low carbohydrate diet as a diet that's less than 10% of energy from calories, possibly even lower than that, depending on your total amount of calories. Anyone who's followed that diet, we've seen this before. And so we know two things here that are very important to disclaim. First, the higher fat group was not a low carb diet. But no one's calling it a low-carb diet, so that's okay. Don't let it be used as evidence against a low-carb diet, because it wasn't low-carb at all. It wasn't even close to that. But second, and more importantly, and this is where we're having problems, this higher-fat diet group was not, as I've said many times, was not a high-fat diet. It was in a disastrous middle area. And if anything, it was a high soybean oil diet. 24% of calories from soybean oil, and you think you can make any conclusions outside of avoiding soybean oil? You gotta be kidding me. But that's what's happening here. Now to me, for humans, I consider a high-fat diet to be 70% of calories from fat. That is what's high. Anything else puts you in the disastrous middle or lower than that, a low-fat diet. But really, a lot of this stuff is subjective. That's why they call it higher fat. But when you start seeing, and we're already seeing headlines that are calling it a high-fat diet, that's where I have problems, because this was nowhere near what I consider to be, and what many researchers consider to be, a truly high-fat diet for humans. So we're already seeing some headlines getting generated. It's only one day in. I mean, it's only going to get worse. I guarantee it. We're already seeing one press article was titled "Gut Benefits of Moving Away from a High-Fat Diet," and there was a subtitle that "A high-fat diet linked to unfavorable changes in gut bacteria and inflammatory triggers." This wasn't a high-fat diet. Not even close. Instead, what we saw was basically this toxic, poisonous slurry of insulin-spiking carbohydrates with this toxic, nasty, easily oxidized, poisonous, slow-rolling poisonous soybean oil. Polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids that oxidize easily and should not be cooked with. That's what we have here. We have nothing, no other conclusions can be drawn from this. But that's not going to stop them from using this to attack high-fat diets. Meanwhile, the researchers are clearly showing some bias. Listen to this. I'm going to read a quote here. "Compared with a lower-fat diet, long-term consumption of a higher-fat diet appears to be undesirable. For young, healthy adults whose diet is in transition from the traditionally consumed lower-fat, higher-carbohydrate diet to one characterized by an appreciably higher fat content." This is simultaneously right and wrong. Yes, it is higher fat. But now we're using this to attack truly high-fat diets that, of course, would never, ever, ever have soybean oil in them. And they're characterizing these results to attack a truly high-fat diet. And you can see the bias all over the place on there. Now, they're stating higher fat diets, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all high-fat diets are, undesirable. Because we are clearly seeing improved metabolic factors and a ton of weight loss happening, and a lot of people getting off their medications, their diabetes meds, their psoriasis meds, and all that crap you see commercials for. Seeing tons of people getting off this once they get off of these toxic seed oils, the toxic refined sugars, and the toxic refined grains. Some people can handle them, a lot of us can't. And that's why we have such an epidemic on our hands. A lot of people are really starting to say now, though, that these polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids, especially the soybean oil, is worse than the sugar itself. And I'm starting to believe that myself. So, to put it bluntly, if they want to make those claims, they need to test those claims and do it in a way that a dietitian would actually recommend. Use animal sources of fat. Use a spectrum of fats. Olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil, and yes, lard and beef tallow too. Animal fats that actually come with the cut of meat. Anyway, if you want to hear a little bit more, on our blog post we do have a link to Jim Mann, who was on Radio New Zealand, and he talked about this. And I'm not going to leave any comments. Instead, the best comment I'm going to leave here about what he said, you can listen to it. The best comment comes from a fellow named George Henderson on Twitter, who stated this: "Listening to this gives you a good idea of how willing the old guard are to misrepresent our diets in order to still be able to criticize them. It's as if man's a lawyer, not a doctor." These researchers need to do what's right. They've already violated the Hippocratic Oath. They did harm. They gave 24% of a known inflammatory substance to 1/3 of the participants, and a whole bunch of it probably to the other third. They need to do what's right and stop using this to criticize high-fat diets, but instead do the right thing and use it to criticize those who are using soybean oil in China and everywhere. It's all over the place. If you look at all the processed food in the middle of the grocery store, stay out of those aisles. In China, it is true. They are increasing fat intake as they get more westernized. And it's sadly true that they are cooking more with this toxic soybean oil. What the researchers need to do is emphasize that the Chinese citizens and everyone around the world needs to stay away from this particular fatty acid. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the other fatty acids are bad as well. You can't blame an entire macronutrient category for the crimes that were committed by the one most poisonous of them all. So regardless of the truth, the process has already begun. The wheels are already in motion. The propaganda machine is going, and that headline's already been written. And there's literally nothing stopping the media from protecting their friends, protecting their investments, protecting their sponsors, and twisting this into yet another crusade against a species-appropriate diet. And that means one that actually includes sources of fats and proteins from animal-based sources. You gotta realize, these people are sick, and they will stop at nothing to obfuscate and keep you from the truth as you are on your search to finding and living a healthy life. Your health, vitality, and strength, they are of no interest to the big food, big agri, big pharma lobbies, and their friends at the big establishment media. So why are you listening to them? Why are you believing these headlines? Thankfully, though, we live in the era of the internet and social media. And you have a front row seat. This is, like I said in our Jillian Michaels little video, there is an information war going on. They never realized how powerful the internet would be. And while social media does have its walled gardens and all that, you still have the ability, if you care to find out the truth, you still have the ability to find these studies, to see the sources, and you have a front row seat to this information war. And as long as we have our First Amendment rights, we will be able to tell the truth and to weed out the data from the ridiculous headlines. And you can realize that studies like this one are being used for illegitimate purposes and are not only unethical, but actually harmful. My name is Mike Roberto. Thanks for watching. See you in the comments section.
Welcome to Price Plow.